Hi everybody, Charmaine McGuffey here for Lunchtime Live. Thank you so much for joining in. This is a half hour and we are going to talk about training today. I'm going to wait a little bit, just kind of let some people get on, who might want to watch and so forth. And certainly this is interactive because it's Facebook Live. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes and then I'm going to take questions. So please send me your questions and I'll try to answer them regarding training for law enforcement, training for corrections and jails. And what I will say about training is this: when things go wrong in our uniformed forces, people tend to point to training. They start talking about training immediately. How are officers trained? Do we need better training, different training? And a lot of times, training can be a really strong answer to some dysfunction that may go on in law enforcement. It can be an answer to someone who is not tactically doing things right. But training is just one piece of a sheriff's office. Training is just one piece of a police office. And we train our recruits when they come in. First off, everybody receives a state-mandated training, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to talk about the fact that I am a trainer. I was a career trainer. I was captain of the Sheriff's Corrections Training Academy, and I was also an accomplished trainer on the state level. So I trained in peace officer academies. I've trained all over the state of Ohio. I was at one point one of only 6 training instructors in the state of Ohio, and that's an instructor who is certified to train other instructors on how to train. So I have a varied background in training. I was a self-defense instructor for many, many years, ran the Corrections Training Academy for almost 20 years, and did lots of in-service training and so forth. One of the other things I did was I was a hostage negotiator on our special response team, which is the Sheriff's Office SWAT team, if you will. And I had to go through extensive training for that team. And one of the things that we did is we went to FBI training, we went to certification trainings, hours and hours of training to arrive in an emergency and take control and make sure that we preserve life, our lives, the lives of anyone who are held hostage, and the life of the person who may either be barricaded or holding someone hostage. And I always say to people, regardless of how well you're trained, really, regardless of how well your officers are trained, there is always the unknown. There's always the, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And that's what I always walked into every scenario with. I had that in my mind. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. And the key factor is you stay calm and you roll with it, you fix what you can, and you keep going. I was a hostage negotiator when we were called to someone's house, and this man was barricaded in his basement. He was down in the basement. He had a very large knife. He had been having some mental health crisis for most of the day. His wife and children were very concerned. He had been drinking and so forth. So it was a very dangerous situation. He was threatening us. He was threatening the family. He was threatening himself. And I ended up, as fate would have it, in a face-to-face hostage negotiation. In fact, a barricaded negotiation with this individual. And, my goal in my training, told me, slow the situation down, engage this person, talk to this person, and we want to keep the person talking, and we want to keep the situation calm. And I, of course, was surrounded by tactical people because this is someone who can be very dangerous. I mean, he has an edged weapon, a large butcher knife, and he continued to walk back and forth, like close to me and then away from me, to me and away from me as we talked. And finally, after about an hour of me talking to him, first of all, I could tell that he just didn't relate to me. I just kept trying and talking and so forth. So he eventually ran into a room, a small room down in the basement, and closed the door. So I was still talking to him, trying to get him out, and finally I got word from the tactical guys that he said, listen, tell her if she will shut up, I will come out. And that's exactly what I did. I said, oh, okay, great. And he did. He came out from his situation. We were able to take control of him and get him some help and so forth. But, you know, what happened there was I didn't, you know, there wasn't any magic thing that I did. I did what I was trained to do, which was keep talking, keep the situation low key, keep the situation rolling, and de-escalate with every word that comes out of my mouth. And finally, I just simply wore him down to the point where he said, okay, enough. You know, I think he wanted a fight when we showed up, and by the time we left, he just wanted to leave that situation, and me, of course. So at any rate, it's an example of what happens when you use your training no matter what. You stick to it, you stay with it, and those are things that can de-escalate situations. You know, I tell you, I went to training one time too. I want to tell you this incident, and this was really good training, and this is one of the things that we train our officers to do. So this man was teaching about mental health crisis. That was our instructor. And and to teach this, he wanted to simulate what happens to someone who is mentally ill, right? When they can't really control what's going on in their brain all the time. So what we did is we paired off in pairs, and he said, now one of you is the suspect and one of you is the interviewer. So here's the suspect who's just coming into jail, been arrested, and here you are, the interviewer, trying to get this basic information because you're booking this person into jail. And then those of us that were the suspect, we put on headphones. And we wore the headphones during that time period that we were questioned about simple things. Our name, our address, you know, where we live, who we hang around with, things like that. But in the headphones, the entire time that we're being interviewed, there are voices. There are little whispering voices like, oh, look to your left. Oh, what do you think about this? Hey, don't you want to get out of here? Hey, and it was so surreal because, you know, it was very, very hard to pay attention to what the officer was asking me, what the officer was telling me to do, because I had voices in my head, literally. And what it did is it really brought home the issues of mental illness and how mental illness can affect someone in a way that we, who are not experiencing those kinds of symptoms, can misrepresent, misunderstand. We can escalate a situation simply because we don't know. We're not educated on what's going on with this person. So that scenario in training really brought home to me the fact that when I talk to someone who's mentally ill, I want to factor in that this person is likely very distracted. This person is likely not so much focused on me as they are on their own issues and their own troubles and their own struggles. And it will help. It will help me in de-escalating. And in fact, that's exactly what we want to do when we train officers. We want to train them to, above all, slow it down and start de-escalating when you can. Now, I've been a self-defense instructor for many, many years, and I can tell you this. There are times when you can't anticipate. There are times when you can't de-escalate. There are times when you can walk into a situation and wham, you are making decisions in microseconds, trying to figure out how you can keep yourself safe, how you can keep this person safe, and maybe stop them from harming someone else. And those situations are incredibly difficult for law enforcement. We do have training for law enforcement that encompasses, one, in their recruit phase. When they come into the recruit phase, there is a number of hours that you must complete to complete training and have a certificate from the Ohio Peace Officer Academy. That is the watchdog for training for police officers in the state of Ohio. And that program, Peace Officer Training Academy, is that the overseer of that is the Ohio Attorney General's office, and then of course higher up the governor. So we heard Governor DeWine come on and talk a little bit about how he wanted to increase training, some of the things he wanted to do regarding the documentation of how officers are trained, maybe what the use of force incidences are in the state, and things like that. So officers typically go through 730 hours of training to become a police officer. That's the minimum state requirement. Now, there are other, municipalities that even go over that, right? Cincinnati Police, for instance, is 1,100 hours, and their academy is typically 28 weeks. Now, with the 737-hour academies, those are called open enrollment. So people can go and join those academies without being sponsored by a police officer, or police agency, I should say, and they can, learn and get the certificate to be a peace officer. When they do that, then they have to find a department to hire them. And once they're hired, then there is a segment of training called field training officer training, right? So you have a field training officer that rides with you for a very long time, makes sure that you understand all of the factors and all the things that go into being out there on the street. So, as we talk about this, and there has been some discussion regarding the hours of training and how officers are trained initially. So just as comparison, the person who cuts your hair has to have 1,500 hours of training. So 737 for police officers to have that certificate, and 1,500 hours for the person who cuts your hair to have their certificate. So there are people who really, are saying, do we have enough training for police officers? Do we have enough training for jail officers? And I'd like to make that distinction for you too, because there is a different distinction in a jail certification and a peace officer certification. I hold both. I've been a police officer, peace officer trained, certified for many, many years. In that capacity, again, I've trained around the state of Ohio. But when we talk about jail training is different. Jail training is less. It's 159 required minimum hours of training to be a certified jail officer, corrections officer in the state of Ohio. And in that training, we work with a number of different curriculums. Interpersonal skills, interpersonal relations, again, all guided to de-escalation. We talk about mental health crisis. We go through a very rigorous health program regarding hepatitis B and all the health emergencies that can happen, particularly within a jail and outside the jail as well. Many of our officers in the Sheriff's Department, by the way, hold dual certifications, meaning that everybody that comes into our office is trained as a corrections officer in a course that I don't know what hours they're using now, but we were typically doing a 8-week training course with our officers that included physical fitness and all the other trappings of any academy that would run in the state of Ohio. So at any rate, we turn out great officers when we follow these minimum training requirements. The officers all have to take a written test. And some of the tests actually in the jail piece, we used to have it where some of the test was actually physical. You had to demonstrate physical skills as well. So you have to come out with a 70% on those tests. And when you come out with that 70%, then you are certified. And we put our stamp on you to say you have passed the minimum requirements to be a police officer, to be a jail officer. And here's the thing. When we talk about training, the trainers influence those students so much, right? As the trainer, you are the person who they are seeing on that front line. And that's why I always, when I ran the training academy, I always like to include supervisors. I like the supervisors who are actually out there, boots on the ground, to come in and train these recruits. I didn't have necessarily a nucleus of just trainers that only did that. I had people that came and went professionally. And I think that worked out very well for a number of students because they got to see these people, one, in the role that they are in as experts. They're out there in that environment and they understand what kinds of things you're going to encounter when you put on that uniform. And when I first started and took over training, we were having an issue with officers coming in and telling the recruits, look, you're in this training class and you've had all these hours of training and you have your notebook and all the things you're doing, and now I'm going to tell you what it's really like. Throw that notebook in the trash. And, that I knew was not good training. So we worked very, very hard to make our training relevant. It has to stick. It has to stick to the environment. Whoever is there being trained has to understand and really believe that this is the truth. These are the things we need to do. And in that regard, I had a sheriff who I trained under, which was Sheriff Simon Lees. And, he was very, very concerned about de-escalation, making sure that we did not go overboard when we used force, that we were not participating in excessive use of force. And we talked quite a bit about that to the recruits. I mean, it's one of the things that keeps you safe physically and legally in our system is to keep your head, keep your mind about you. Don't let your temper get the better of you. Don't let situations get out of control because honestly, it keeps you safe to stick with what we tell you to do and go to those options. And you always have options. That's what we train the officers for. You always have option. And, I want to say that when I was the major, I was very, very focused on de-escalation, and there were officers who talked about something called a one-punch rule. And the one-punch rule was certainly not something that we trained. It wasn't something that was appropriate for our environment or any environment. And the one-punch rule was that you could preemptively punch a prisoner if you felt that prisoner was going to be aggressive with you. And we can all understand common sense-wise that that is not a good practice. When I brought that practice to light, it was stopped. It was, I insisted that we not use that practice, that we not talk about it in that way, that our officers don't just punch people because of the fact that, the top, administrators are okay with it. It's not okay. We can't punch people, we can't use excessive force, and that's all about training. So if you have any questions regarding training and training refreshers, we do refresh training, Joyce Smith is on. Hi Joyce, how are you? Good to see you. Marie Myers here with us, Marty Harrigan, Curry Les, thank you. Hi Daryl Bullock, how are you? You were in my class in 1992. Nice, good to see you, absolutely. Billy Mays is watching. So what we try to do with our officers is bring them back for what's called in-service training. In the sheriff's office in particular, in-service training is super important because once you're out there in the environment for a while, your skills can get rusty. You can become complacent. That's one of the things that happens to officers. They get complacent, they get a little burned out, and sometimes, quite frankly, it helps them to come down to an environment where you have a normal type of a day. You're not working third shift, you're not on a second shift, you're coming into a classroom setting and you are learning something, right? You're refreshing your skills, you're refreshing your mind, your energy. And sometimes, in fact, it's funny because when I would have officers who were struggling in the environment, they tended to be going a little overboard, they didn't want to come to work, they were having kind of a bad attitude sort of thing, I would bring those officers up to training. When those officers came to my attention, I would bring them up to training, and quite frankly, I would ask them to help me train. I would ask them to help me refresh people's memories and minds about how the environment works and how it works on us. And what I found is it was very, very helpful for those officers to participate. There were just, so many ways that just having them involved made such a difference for them. Just the fact that they could come up and talk to people about what their experiences were out in that environment, and it is a very challenging environment. So Faith has a question. Faith Ginrich has a question, and it says, are there any specific trainings that don't currently occur that you would implement? And that is a great question. Right now, I would implement the implicit bias training. Just recently, we saw the Sheriff Jim Neal go on TV and talk about the fact that now he's going to embrace implicit bias training. And, my response to that is, finally, right, in capital letters, finally. People have been asking him, I asked him, a number of people asked him to start implicit bias training with our officers. He resisted that. It was not something he believed in. It was not something that he wanted to focus on or invest any funds in. And that is super unfortunate. So now, and I say this to people who have peacefully made their voices heard, right? Who have peacefully gathered and said, we need change. There's your change. There's one of the changes that you helped initiate. Implicit bias training in the sheriff's office, because you raised your voice and you said, look, I have a vote and I'm going to use my vote, and my vote is going to create real action behind it. And that's some of the action right there. So, our democracy is, it's working, and we should continue to use it in that way, in those peaceful ways. So beyond that implicit bias training, I want to start talking about, our de-escalation training and how well we're training that. A lot of training these days has moved to online, okay, in police departments. It's something that the state started doing a while back. Some police departments do it because, quite frankly, it's a lot cheaper than, doing live instruction. And, I see that computer classes can have a purpose, and certainly we can learn from it. But really, that live instruction, those live scenarios, there's nothing like it. I mean, that's exactly what you have to do. You have to participate, and the more realistic, the better. So we try to create live scenarios that in just a matter of minutes gets your heart racing, gets you into that mindset that, wow, what do I do now? And we want to watch how you handle your stress levels there. And that is a situation that allows you to practice. It allows you to practice the tone of your voice, the volume of your voice, your body language, your eye contact. All of those things matter when we're talking about de-escalation training. And, I always found, too, when I worked in the environment, I was a sergeant for years. I was a corrections officer. I was out in that environment a lot. And when I had a crisis, a person who was having a mental health crisis, one of my first goals when I would walk in and start to address that person, who could be maybe a little violent, a little, combative and so forth, was my goal was to get them to sit down. If I could get them to sit down in a chair and I could sit across from them, I knew that I had a huge margin of success going for me. Because when the person can relax enough that they're listening to you, they want to engage with you, and then that's just it. You let them engage and you let people talk. I mean, that's what a lot of de-escalation is about. You have to have the patience for it. You have to be somebody who has empathy for that person. You have to say to yourself, what is this person going through? What are their struggles? And then if you can, you relate to that person how you can relate to their struggles. And I found that to be very effective, particularly if I'm dealing with people in mental health crisis. Victor Spellin is on. Hey, hi Victor, how are you? He says I was the best. Thank you, Victor, for that. Victor went through our academy, was a corrections officer for a long time, a police officer after that. So thanks, Victor, for tuning in. I appreciate it. So I want to talk about how working in the jail also, by the way, in our department, you have to come into our department into the jail first. That's what you do. You can't just join our department and become a peace officer on the street. And I believe that, and this is my opinion, I think every police officer in the state of Ohio should have to work inside a jail for at least a year before they go out on the street. Because what happens in our department when our officers do that and then they move on to interact with the public, go on to be street officers, etc., they understand how to use their skills. Because in a jail, you don't have a gun, you don't have mace, you don't have a taser with you. you are working in an environment where you are using these skills, right? Your physical body language, your voice, your mind, your brain, and you're a lot of people to these people that are incarcerated. Your mom, your dad, you're the officer, you're a social worker, you're a number of things. And I tell you, it forces officers to use their skills first and force second. And again, I'll use this disclaimer. You know, there are times, and I've experienced it, where you walk into a situation and you have no time. You can't de-escalate. Your de-escalation is to save your life, save the life of somebody else, or get control of a person who is absolutely harming themselves or others. But in general, what we do in that jail is we talk to people, we get to know them, and I think it makes a better officer on the street. And the flip side to that is the people that encounter us as officers in that black and gold oftentimes got to know us from the jail, right? And when they see us out again on the street, when we interact again with them for whatever reason, we can just run into them to say hi. They respect us. You know, there's a level of respect there because we have taken the time to get to know their name, to know who they are, and they know that. And it's a lot harder to dislike someone when you see them face to face all the time, right? It's a lot easier to dislike somebody if you never have to see them, you never have to talk to them or deal with them. But when you do, those are relationships, professional relationships that you create inside that jail. So, you know, I always tell people 1 year inside of a jail, and wow, you've experienced a lot, because the segment and culture of that jail is so accelerated because you have so many people living in such a confined space that, there are just multitudes of issues and problems and things that come up daily for you to handle. And that's exactly why I think our officers in the black and gold they're just fabulous. They are out there, most are in that uniform for the right reason. They're professionals, they work very, very hard, and I can't wait to get back to uniform because I miss those guys. I miss having that purpose of helping people along in their lives. And I mean helping them along whether I'm the sheriff and I'm helping them with the culture, the uniform culture of the jail, or I'm helping prisoners embrace reform, better their lives, or I'm helping to educate the public. Because truly, there's so much about law enforcement that has been a little bit in the shadows for lots of reasons. People don't talk about it, people weren't interested in it, and now they are. And we need people to represent the police who are willing to go out to the public and tell people what the deal is and how it's done and what we think. So I have a question here. I have 2 minutes left. I have a question. How are complaints about the police handled? So in our department, you can file a formal complaint in our sheriff's office downtown. You can go downtown to the sheriff's office. You can ask for a complaint form, and you can fill out your complaint, write down, and I encourage you to write down as much detail as possible. Those complaints are funneled through to Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs will then investigate those complaints, and they should get back to you. You should have some remedy as to how your complaint was handled and what happened with your complaint. So that's how they're done. So I'd also like to remind people to please let us know what topics you're interested in having me talk about. And nothing's off the table. We can run the gamut here, and I do thank you all for joining. I do have a question about cultural diversity training and mental health training, which perhaps we can address in another issue. So thank you very much. I'll write that down, and we'll put that on our agenda. So please follow me on social media, share my videos and posts, and I thank you so much. McGuffeyforsheriff.com. See you next week. Thank you.